So the next topic is ethics and transplants. So first, this is a keyword and this is a keyword, so we need to define those words. So, an ethical decision uses ethical criteria to reach an answer that most people think is right or fair. So the things you need to know there are it uses ethical criteria as opposed to scientific data to reach an answer that most people think is right or fair. So basically it's what most people think is right. So that's what the word ethics means. The next word we need to define is transplant. So in a transplant, a healthy organ such as a heart or a liver is taken from one body, which is called the donor, and is put into a patient who's known as the recipient, and that replaces an organ in the recipient that no longer works. So we'll draw a donor. So I could draw my uncle, who's only got a little bit of hair left, and he had 2 kidneys there, and his brother, who was the recipient, needed a kidney transplant. So he had one that wasn't working. So in the kidney transplant, one kidney was taken from the donor and was put into the recipient to replace the one that wasn't working. So that's all the transplant means. And then he was happy in the end because he got his organ from the donor. All sorts of organs can be donated. The cornea from your eyes, your heart, your lungs, your liver, skin, maybe sometimes. But they are trying to grow new skin from stem cells, but that's another topic. You don't need to know that. So far we've done ethical criteria and what a transplant is. The next part that we need to know is why deciding who gets a transplant is so difficult. So I'll put a title of difficult decisions. Each year more than 1,000 people in the UK die while they're waiting for transplants. This is because there's not enough donor organs. So in the UK we have an opt-in system. I'll just write that. And that means that you have to make a conscious decision to carry a donor card, which is one of these, which says that when you die, you want your organs to go to somebody else. Places like Germany have an opt-out system, and that means that when you die, it's automatically assumed that you'll donate all your organs. Only if you opt out and say, no, I don't want to, will your organs not be donated. So in places like Germany, waiting lists for organs are really small compared to in England. So this is a UK thing. Okay, in order to decide who gets organs then, because there's not enough, doctors, as opposed to, they use ethical criteria, but they also use scientific criteria. scientific criteria are based on the likelihood of success. So some examples are whether the donor and the recipient have similar tissues, to avoid rejection, similar ages, and similar location. Because chances are, if a donor heart becomes available and you're the one who needs the heart and the donor heart is in Manchester, near to you, then the chance of you getting that heart compared to someone in Scotland who needs it is greater in your favour. Another scientific criteria that's used, the last one, is how ill the patient is. So in other words, who needs it the most? There's problems when it comes to transplants, and they might ask you about this in the exam, is things like, should clinically obese people get heart transplants? Being clinically obese, which is really overweight, can damage your heart. So some hospitals won't perform heart transplants on obese people unless that obese person can prove that they can stick to a weight loss diet. Because doctors think that if you're clinically obese, it's going to put loads of strain on your heart, and if you can't prove that you can lose the weight, it can be seen as kind of a waste of a heart to give one to an obese patient who has a lower chance of survival anyway. So they might ask you about the ethics and the scientific criteria in things like obese people being given donor hearts. Another one they might ask you, which we touched on last time, was should alcoholics be given liver transplants? So if we think again about George Best, he was an alcoholic. He got given a liver, which could have gone to other people, and that's where this comes in. Was it right that George Best was given a liver when he was an alcoholic, and you could say that he chose that lifestyle? So we could do like a pros and cons list, or for and against. So should he have got the liver? Shouldn't he have got the liver? And if you get asked a big question on this in the exam, I'd suggest doing something like this, a for and against, so you can get your argument right in your head. So for George Best having a liver, you could say that he was really ill. Everybody deserves an organ. And that it was the only chance to save his life. On the against side, you could say that he chose that lifestyle and that's a bit like saying it was his decision, so he should have to live with what he chose. You could say that it's a potential waste of an organ because it could have gone to somebody who wasn't an alcoholic. And it could have saved somebody else. So that's ethics and transplants pretty much done. We've defined what ethics means, which is what most people think is right. We've defined what a transplant is, which is where you take a healthy organ from a donor and give it to a recipient. we've talked about the difference between ethical criteria, what most people think is right, and scientific criteria, which is how doctors make decisions on who should get an organ, which are things like if the donor and the recipient have similar tissues, similar ages, a similar location, and how ill the patient is. And we've also touched upon the fact that it's massively difficult decisions that doctors have to make because there's not enough organs in the UK, because we have an opt-in system, as opposed to places like Germany, which have an opt-out system. So you could use the fact that Germany has an opt-out system in an exam answer to say that the opt-out system means that they've got lower waiting times or shorter waiting lists for organs, whereas our waiting lists are massive. So Germany have less people dying while they're on the waiting list, whereas we have loads dying on the waiting list because we have this opt-in. You have to choose to go on the donor register and get this donor card, as opposed to Germany. So that's ethics and transplant done. Again, we've just condensed all of this, which is a lot of reading and a lot of memorisation, into just this. So tune in next time. It's now 10:30 and I'm going all night. Next is pathogens and infection.